Hey guys, it's Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hello, thank you for finding me. If you could subscribe and give us a comment, let me know what you think about the video, give us a thumbs up, that would be awesome. Thank you so much. What are we here to do today? Blu-ray review, and not just any Blu-ray review. This is a very exciting Blu-ray review. This is a historically important film. This is the first time ever that this new restoration has been released on Blu-ray. The film is One-Armed Boxer, starring and written by and directed by Jimmy Wang Yu. It was released in 1972. And so there's a lot to unpack here. I'm going to talk very briefly about the historical importance of this film, which I have just been learning about over the past few months. I had never seen this film before. And I didn't know a ton about... If you watch the channel, you know I love like Shaw Brothers movies and like old school 70s kung fu kind of stuff, but I don't know a ton of detail about the history of those films. I really know more about the newer stuff. Well, by newer, I mean like the 80s and 90s stuff. But even then, my knowledge of the history is spotty because I've always been more about just like watching and consuming the films and stuff like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of this film and why it's important. I'm going to talk about the physical aspects of the release and the presentation of the film here. And then I'm going to talk about the bonus features and the movie itself. So this movie is, like I said, written and directed by Jimmy Wang Yu. And Jimmy Wang Yu made a movie called The Chinese Boxer, which is really kind of considered by a lot of people to be like ground zero for modern kung fu films. That movie came out in 1970. He was also the star of The One-Armed Swordsman, which came out in 1967, was directed by Chang Che. And The One-Armed Swordsman is a hugely historical important film because that was really like the beginning of like the machismo, male-dominated, hyper-violent like wuxia films that the Shaw Brothers were making, right? These like fantasy and historical films. And it came out just after Come Drink With Me, which is really kind of like a lot of people point to as like the beginning of that style. And then The One-Armed Swordsman really set a lot of things in stone. It was the first Hong Kong film to make $1 million at the $1 million Hong Kong dollars at the Hong Kong box office. So it was a huge hit. It's a very important movie. And so at that point in his career, after One-Armed Swordsman and various other films that he was in, and then after, he actually also wrote and directed and starred in The Chinese Boxer because he was sick of doing those wuxia films. He wanted to make a more modern type of kung fu film. So Shaw Brothers let him write and direct his own movie. That movie was a huge hit. And so he was huge at that time. Like he was Bruce Lee before Bruce Lee existed basically in Asia. Obviously didn't have the success in the US at the time that Bruce Lee did. But he was so famous. And he ended up making this film, One-Armed Boxer, for Golden Harvest. He went to Taiwan and he started making films for Golden Harvest after leaving the Shaw Brothers because he felt like they weren't paying him enough and giving him enough respect and stuff like that. To give you a little bit of context for what this film is, so to talk about the release from Eureka, it is there's a first run of 2000 that is a limited edition that has the slipcase with the artwork by Darren Wheeling. It has a reversible cover art with poster on it, and then it has a booklet. The booklet is super cool. So if you can get one of the first 2000, if you're interested in picking up this release, I would say definitely get it. It has two things in it. It has an essay by James Oliver that's really good. It does a lot to contextualize Jimmy Wang Yu's career. It talks about The Chinese Boxer. It talks about One-Armed Boxer. It talks about One-Armed Swordsman. It talks about Bruce Lee. It talks about how he actually... This is really interesting. I didn't know this before. I had known that a little bit about his career. Like I knew he was in Taiwan for a while. He went to Taiwan because the Shaw Brothers sued him after he left because he was under contract. He's like, whatever, screw you, I'm leaving. I'm gonna make movies for Golden Harvest, and he just went to Taiwan. So there's a lot of like interesting stuff about him in there. Some quotes from him and stuff like that. So it's a really good essay. And it also talks about how Jimmy Wang Yu is really important in the development of the filmmaking techniques of Hong Kong and martial arts cinema because he was really the first director to emphasize the use of filmmaking techniques to enhance the experience, whereas all the other previous filmmakers have really just focused on the ability of the martial artist in the film. I'm going to talk more about some of the formal techniques of this movie that I thought were really interesting and impressive when I talk about the movie later in the review. So that's the essay, and then there's also an excerpt from a book called Martial Arts Films in the 1970s that you'll have seen. If you like look up these types of things, if you're in Facebook groups and stuff, you'll definitely see the cover art for this book before. It's like a popular book. And so there's a little bit about the film from that book too. So you get both of those things in the booklet. So that's really cool. And then to talk about the bonus features. So you have the U.S. trailer. I think it was called The Chinese Professionals when it came out in the U.S., like on the Grindhouse circuit and stuff like that. You have the original Hong Kong trailer, which is super cool. You have two mono Mandarin tracks, the original and an alternate, and then you have the English dub, and you have subtitles to go along with that. And I'm just making sure that I'm not leaving any of the bits and bobs off of here. There's a stills gallery, actually, it's really cool, that has a bunch of images from the making of the film, like promotional images, and then also like stills from the film and stuff like that, but like still photography that was taken on the set, not like just screen caps from the movie. And then, like I said, this is the worldwide Blu-ray debut of this restoration of the film that was made from original material. So, to talk about the presentation of the movie, I watched this on a 59-inch TV, so nice big TV screen. Looks incredible. Frank Jang actually says in his commentary, you know, this movie is 49 years old at this point, and he's seen this movie several times before, and to see it looking like this is kind of like you got to pinch yourself, because it's like it's a pretty popular movie, and it's a movie that a lot of people really love. So to see it looking like this is really, really stunning. And what I found to be really interesting about this this new restoration, which you see, I talked about this in Fearless Hyena too, which you see behind me there, the Jackie Chan film. They were making these movies pretty quickly, and even though they had budgets, they didn't have like big budgets, right? And so you can see stuff in this film where there's like out of focus shots, right? Whereas like in a really big budget movie or in like a US studio movie or whatever, they would have noticed that and gone back and shot it again. And with this, they just kind of put it in the film. And now that you have these really clear presentations and we're watching them on these giant TVs, you can see those little kind of mistakes. And I really like that because it makes it very human. You feel the human touch on the film. And so you can think more about the people that were making it and where it comes from and stuff like that. And both Frank Zhang and his audio commentary, and Frank Zhang has an audio commentary on here, I should say, if you know, you'll know who he is if you watch the channel, because I interviewed him. I will be interviewing him again, hopefully pretty soon. We've actually talked about doing an in-person interview. He might be down in LA, so that would be really cool. So fingers crossed for that. But Frank is awesome. He worked at Tai Seng for a very long time and New York Asian Film Festival he's affiliated with and stuff like that. And so Frank talks about Jimmy Wang Yu's kind of personal history, and so does James Oliver in his essay. So that's to tie that into being able to see like these little imperfections in the film and think about the people behind it, I think is really interesting. Something else I have to ask, if you know, let me know. Did they have focus pullers on these movies? Because there are so many zooms in this movie where the shot is like perfect, and then they zoom and everything is out of focus, and I'm like, are they using like insanely wide lenses, or like what is going on here? But like it happens every time they do these crazy zooms, is it goes out of focus. So if you know, drop in the comments, let me know what the deal is with that. So that basically covers the packaging and the presentation of the film. So what's left to do now is I'm going to talk to you about the movie, and then as I talk about the movie, I'm also going to talk about Frank's audio commentary and kind of like intertwine my thoughts on the two of those and kind of share some stuff that Frank shared with you to get you excited about this, because it's an excellent audio commentary. If you've ever listened to Frank's commentaries, you know they're very, very excellent. So I'm going to talk about some things I noticed about this film, you know, being like fresh to this and having never seen it. First of all, the narrative style. This movie is so simple, it's like perfect. It's I sometimes would joke with my friends. You know, I went to grad school for screenwriting, right? So we would sometimes joke that screenwriting was communist because it's basically about a dialectic, right? Something happens, someone reacts to that. So like you have an event, a situation, and then a new situation, a new event. You know what I mean? It's just like this wheel constantly spinning, right? And that's exactly what this movie is. Like there's a fight at the beginning, and every single thing that happens after that first fight is a reaction to that first fight. Like the fight happens, and then there's a revenge fight, and then there's a revenge fight, and then there's a revenge fight. That's like the whole movie. And it's so simple to the point that there's like a recovery sequence. You know, a lot of these films, like you have the hero gets the crap beaten out of them, right? And they have to go and recover somewhere or train, or like someone comes and helps them or something like that, right? And in this movie, that is literally a photo montage. Like, screw that. We don't have time for this nonsense. We need fights. This movie is all about fights, and it is nonstop, insane, buck wild fights. And there's so many fighters in this movie. So to give you basically what the idea is, that these two martial arts rival schools are fighting against one another. One is legit and like runs a brick factory and a dyeing mill, and they're like nice people. And one is like the bad guys who do bad stuff like opium, right? And prostitutes, and they're just bad people. And the bad guys get their asses whooped by the good guys, and so they hire martial arts experts from all over Asia to come and fight against the good guys. And so you see all these different styles. There's like Taekwondo, there's Judo, and all this different stuff. And this is as I said before, talking about the historical importance of this film, this is a kung fu movie. This is a grounded movie about fighting styles. It's not really a shapes film, although it does have that element of like I do Muay Thai, so here's how I fight. It has some of that basher brawler kind of influence in it too. There are some fight scenes that are just like really brutal, realistic, almost like street fighting. And what's interesting about that is that Jimmy Wang Yu is actually he was a street fighter at one point. He was very athletic, and he came from like a wealthy family, and he was just kind of like, you know, he was a swimmer, and he actually came to Hong Kong to do like competitive swimming and stuff like that as a horseback rider and like all this stuff. And he got into martial arts, and Frank tells the whole story of how he ended up getting his contract with Shaw and how he got in with, you know, Raymond Chow Golden Harvest and all that stuff. It's really interesting. I won't like give you all the details and check out the commentary, but he basically, when he started directing his own films and working directly with the fight choreographers, he started basing the fight scenes and the fight style on his own strengths, because he wasn't one of these people, you know, who had been training his entire life and was an expert martial artist, right? So, but he was very athletic and he knew some martial arts. So he based that fighting style around that. And he also used a lot of really interesting film techniques. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm also going to talk about the fact that this movie really reminded me of some Japanese films. And interestingly, in his audio commentary, Frank does say that you see the influence of like Chambara, Kurosawa, Zatoichi, like that kind of stuff, right? The two things where I really noticed this were a little bit in the pacing. And there are pauses in the fight scenes. There's silence where you hear just noises in the background, right? And there's and the other thing I'll mention is that the locations and the way the locations are shot. There are really fascinating, varied locations in this film. They're always really interesting, and they're not shot in like a generic flat, let's just show the martial arts way. There are really interesting angles. There's moving camera. There's handheld camera. There's like dolly shots and stuff like that. Like it's a very formally diverse film, and I love that because I love like the form of cinema, seeing how people employ that form to tell their stories and articulate what they're trying to articulate to the audience. There are two things that kind of reminded me of harakiri, especially, but Japanese films of that period, you know, the 60s, 50s and 60s, and Kobayashi and Kurosawa and people like that. One, there are some compositions where there's a lot of people stacked and spread, right? So what I mean by that sounds like I'm talking about adult films. Okay. But what I mean by that is that in Japan, right, traditional Japanese architecture is very wide and can be kind of low. Right? So when you have these super widescreen compositions, the architecture lends itself to that because it's very wide. And so in movies like Harakiri, you have these compositions where there's tons of people in the shot, but they're spread across the architecture. But in addition to that, they're stacking them at different depths of field to give the sense of depth, right? Because if you ever talk to people about, you know, like film professors or like directors, cinematographers, people like that, about what things that make cinema a unique form, part of it is depth, right? Because that's something that the camera really gives you and that the physical space of cinema really gives you that you can't get from like theater and stuff like that, right? And so there are some compositions in One Arm Boxer that really reminded me of these kind of Japanese compositions where you have people stacked like side to side with a lot of characters, but then you also have different planes of depth too. And the compositions that creates, the shapes that it makes on the screen, I think are really, really interesting. The other thing that he does here that I think is really interesting is he uses a lot of parallax and which is basically like the idea of you put objects between the thing you're shooting and the camera to create dynamic movements in space, right? And so rather than just like shooting someone walking down the street, in this film, Jimmy Wang Yu will shoot someone at an angle as they're moving between a building and something else that's in front of the camera, like these ropes hanging down, right? Or like the posts that are holding up a roof. And so it creates depth and it creates dynamic movement of people moving through spaces as things are in front of the camera, creating like planes of movement, right? It's really, really interesting the way he does that. It kind of reminds me of the scene in Harakiri where they're walking to that big duel where it's really windy in the field, and they walk through the graveyard, and then they're walking down the path while the trees are kind of hanging in front of the camera, and it creates like a really great sense of mood, but also really interesting dynamic stuff with movement within the camera. So, I mean, but beyond like these things that I'm noticing about formal aspects and stuff like that, so just a really fun movie. It's just like constant ass. Like this is definitely in my probably like top 5, definitely top 10, probably top 5 movies that I have watched for this channel without having seen them before. Like I just loved it. It's so much fun. It's such a joy to watch if you're fans of these films and you just love like the fight scenes and the history of it. And like Frank talks about in his commentary track, like for instance, when it takes place, you know, based on like people's hairstyles and the clothing that they're wearing and stuff like that. And he talks about something that's really interesting actually is why is it Mandarin, right? Because so many of these films are Cantonese, and Frank talks about that. And there's a couple reasons for it, and they're really, really interesting. And I won't tell them to you here because you should really just go and listen to him talk about it because he's the expert. But he talks a lot also about the history of, and this was fascinating to me, like Shaw, Golden Harvest, Jimmy Wang Yu, and Bruce Lee, and like how those things all kind of fit together in that era and the evolution of these movies. And it's not a lot. That's like, again, that's not something I know a lot about. So it's really, really fascinating to be able to learn that watching this film and watching the audio commentary. I mean, he talks about the, you know, like in Hard Boiled, they bring the birds into the tea house, and you see that in like some old Shaw films and stuff like that too. That happens in this, in the opening scene. These guys have their birds, and Frank talks about like the symbolism of the birds and why people brought birds into tea houses and like stuff like that, like the cultural significance of it. He translates some signs, which is really interesting. There's like signs in the background in the movie, you know, that are in Chinese, and he'll translate the signs and talk about the Chinese cultural significance of the signs and stuff like that. But like just so much great information. He talks about actually seeing the commercials for these movies on TV as a kid and how they weren't thought of as appropriate for children because they were really violent. So he would like see the trailer and be like, oh, I really want to see that movie, but his parents wouldn't let him see it and stuff like that. So it's just like personal history too that's like really cool. So the movie is One Armed Boxer. If you are a fan of martial arts films, if you're a fan of Hong Kong cinema more generally, you want to learn more about the history, you want to see like the really important films, go and get this movie like right away. Seriously, get one of like the first 2000 because the booklet is really cool too and it adds to the experience of it. I think someone is putting out Chinese Boxer at some point this year on Blu-ray. I feel like someone sent me an Amazon listing for it. It may have been 88, it may have been Eureka. You know how sometimes Amazon listings will show up before a title is announced because they're getting ready to like make their announcement? I think someone told me that they saw a Chinese Boxer on Amazon UK. So that, I mean, as I said, that's a really historically significant film. Like that film was hugely influential on Fist of Fury, the Bruce Lee film, and like a bunch of other movies. And so hopefully that does come out on Blu-ray because I would love to get my hands on that. It's another one I haven't seen. Review that and talk about the historical significance of it and stuff. So my name is Will. This is Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. I thank you again so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
马无道，咱们终于又见面了。原来你这个断胳膊的还没死。阎王殿客满，不收我。